They slammed the door on a pregnant widow until an old man saw the letter hidden under her blouse and remembered a name he'd been forbidden to say for 20 years. No one came out to greet her. She stood at the gate of the ranch, covered in dust, a battered suitcase in one hand, and a child growing in her belly. She'd walked the last stretch alone, under the punishing Highland sun, the weight of the pregnancy and the weight of the road bending her spine in equal measure. The field hands stopped working. The rancher's wife shut a window without a word. And from the stable, an old man stared at her like he was looking at a ghost. The young woman managed only one sentence. "I was told Don Eusebio lives here." The old man's water bucket hit the ground, because no one had spoken that name on this land in 20 years. And sewn into the lining of her blouse, that dusty, pregnant stranger was carrying a letter that could tear the whole family apart. Stay with me, Bas, because what that letter said had been buried for 2 decades, and the woman carrying it had no idea of the storm she was about to unleash with a single name. A man who never talked about his past. Her name was Amparo, 22 years old. To understand how she ended up at that remote ranch in the Chiapas highlands, pregnant, alone, unwelcome. You have to go back to where she came from. And where she came from starts, like so many stories do, with a man who never talked about his past. Amparo had grown up poor, in a village days away from that ranch by road. At 19, she married a quiet young laborer named Refugio, who'd arrived in her town a few years earlier with nothing but his hands, and a sadness he carried like a stone he never set down. Refugio was a good man, steady, serious, a man of few words. But something sat behind his eyes. Something old that surfaced when he thought no one was watching. He said he'd grown up far away, raised by his father alone, and that his father had died young. When Amparo asked about the rest of his family, he changed the subject or answered in vague half-sentences. Only once, a rainy night, a year into their marriage when the silence between them had finally softened into trust, did he say more. They were sitting by the fire. Rain hammered the roof, and in the low voice of a man opening a box he'd kept shut for years, Refugio told her the truth. His father's name was Eusebio. They'd lived poor their whole lives, moving from town to town, working other men's land. But it hadn't always been that way. There had been a ranch once, a big one, in the Chiapas highlands. Cattle, workers, a stone house that had belonged to the family since his grandfather's time. "Who took it from you?" Amparo asked. "His own brother," Refugio said. "My uncle. A man named Crisoforo." The story came out in pieces. Refugio's grandfather had left the ranch to his 2 sons equally. Crisoforo, the elder, was ambitious. And with forged papers and bribed officials, he'd cut his younger brother out entirely and thrown him off the land while Refugio was still a nursing infant. Eusebio hadn't fought back. He had no money and no allies against a brother who had both. He'd simply taken his son and disappeared to start over. Poor, silent, far away. "And he never tried to get it back?" Amparo asked. Refugio was quiet for a long moment. He said he had proof. A letter, something my own grandfather wrote before he died, spelling out exactly how the land should be split. Proof the ranch belonged to both brothers, and that Crisoforo stole it. My father kept that letter his whole life, said that someday, when I was a man, we'd go back together and claim what was ours. Why didn't you? Because he died first, Refugio said, and I was left alone, not knowing how to fight a battle like that by myself. I kept the letter because it was his. But a poor man alone doesn't take on a powerful family, so I did what he did. I kept walking. That was the only time he ever spoke of it. Amparo filed it away as an old wound of her husband's, not knowing that one day it would become her story too. A dying man's last request. Refugio died when Amparo was 4 months pregnant. A fever, the kind that tears through poor villages and leaves no time to fight it. In 3 days, the strong, quiet man she loved burned through delirium and was gone. In his final hours, barely able to speak, he pulled her close. He told her where the letter was. Sewn into the lining of an old jacket at the bottom of the trunk, the one she'd always assumed was just something he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He told her it was their child's inheritance. Proof that the baby she carried had a claim to land, to a name, to something more than the poverty he'd been able to give her. Amparo held his burning hand and told him to rest, that they'd talk about it once he was better. They both knew that wasn't true. And with the last strength in his body, Refugio gripped her hand hard enough to startle her, as if trying to pass her every ounce of resolve he'd never had himself. "The ranch in the highlands," he whispered. "Find Don Eusebio." "No, my father's gone." "Find the ranch. Say you come on behalf of Eusebio. The letter proves everything." "Don't let my son be born with nothing, Amparo. Don't let what happened to me happen to him." Then he was gone. Amparo was alone, widowed, pregnant, with no one left in a town that had never really been hers either. She spent the first weeks lost in grief. But as her belly grew, so did something else. A resolve she hadn't known she had. She pulled the jacket from the trunk, unpicked the stitching with trembling fingers. And there it was. An old, yellowed letter, folded in four, wrapped in a scrap of waxed cloth. The handwriting belonged to another era. Firm, signed, sealed, with the marks of witnesses. The kind that gave a document real weight in the old days. Amparo didn't understand every legal term, but she understood the heart of it. It was the last will of Refugio's grandfather, the father of Eusebio and Crisoforo, dividing the Highland Ranch equally between his two sons. Proof that half of that land belonged to Eusebio, and by extension to Refugio, and by extension to the child growing inside her. She could have burned it, gone on living her small, safe, poor life, far from a powerful family that could crush her without blinking. That would have been the sensible thing. Instead, she thought of her son, of Refugio's dying words, of the old sadness in her husband's eyes that finally made sense. The sadness of a man who died poor knowing he'd been owed something better, and never found the courage to demand it. Amparo decided she would find that courage. Not for herself, for the child. The next day, she started preparing for a journey into the Chiapas highlands, toward a ranch she'd never seen, a family that would hate her on sight, with a letter stitched back into her clothes and a single name on her lips. Eusebio. The old man who remembered the journey was brutal for a pregnant woman. Days on borrowed carts, sleeping wherever she could, spending her last coins, asking in every village for the family that ruled the highlands, until finally someone told her the big ranch, the Pelaya's place, run by old Don Crisoforo. Though people said he was gravely ill now, and his son Honorio ran things. Crisoforo, the brother who'd stolen everything. Still alive, old and sick, but alive. And so, one afternoon, Amparo walked up to that ranch's gate, dust on her skin, suitcase in hand, child in her belly, and spoke the only name that could open that door. "I was told Don Eusebio lives here. You already know what happened." The field hands froze. The rancher's wife shut the window, and the old man in the stable dropped his bucket, because he was the only person left alive who knew exactly what that name meant. His name was Genaro, past 70, and he'd spent his whole life on that ranch. As a young man, he'd worked for Eusebio and Crisoforo's father. He'd watched both brothers grow up. Back then, his loyalty had belonged to Eusebio, the younger one, the decent one, who treated the workers like people while Crisoforo treated them like animals. And 20 years ago, Genaro had watched the whole betrayal happen with his own eyes. He knew Crisoforo had forged the papers, knew he'd bribed the local officials, knew he'd thrown his own brother off the land through fraud because Genaro had seen it, had been trusted enough, back then, to know what was really going on. He'd watched Eusebio walk away carrying his infant son, with nothing. Genaro never said a word. What could a laborer say? A field hand who talks against his boss ends up in an unmarked grave or on the road with nothing, so he'd stayed silent to survive, the way powerless people do, and carried the truth in his chest for 20 years like a stone he couldn't put down. Some nights he wondered what had become of Eusebio and the boy, whether they were even alive, whether the boy had grown up knowing what was taken from him. So, when a dusty, pregnant stranger showed up at the gate and said Eusebio's name out loud, it was like the dead had started talking again, like 20 years of silence had walked up the road wearing a woman's face. He crossed the yard fast, heart hammering. "Who are you, girl?" he asked, low, so no one else would hear. "Where did you hear that name?" Amparo studied him. Something in the old man's face, the barely contained emotion, told her he wasn't an enemy. "Eusebio was my husband's father," she said. "My husband was named Refugio. He died a few months ago. I'm Amparo, his widow." She put a hand on her belly. "And this is his son." Genado's hand went to his mouth, shaking. The baby. The nursing infant he'd watched carried off the property 20 years ago. That gray morning, his good boss walked out the gate for the last time with a crying child against his chest. That baby had grown into a man. Married. Died. And left behind one more branch of the family Cristoforo had thought he'd cut down to the root 20 years earlier. Genado's eyes filled, and he didn't bother hiding it. "My God," he murmured. "Refugio's son, Eusebio's grandson. Here, on this land." "You knew him?" Amparo asked. "You knew Eusebio?" "I knew him," Genado said, voice cracking. "And I watched what they did to him. I watched them take everything." He dropped his voice further. "You need to be very careful. If you've come to claim what's yours, you're standing on enemy ground. This family has killed for less. Get away from the gate before the boss sends someone. We need to talk." A man who fears you has already lost half the fight. But it was already too late for quiet conversations, because the rancher's wife hadn't shut that window out of disinterest. She'd shut it and run straight to her husband to tell him a stranger had arrived asking about a forbidden name. The rancher was Honorio, Cristoforo's son. Cristoforo himself, the old thief, was dying slowly in the main house, taking his sins to the grave one labored breath at a time. Honorio had inherited the ranch from his father, and along with it, his father's ambition and cruelty somewhat, but not his cunning. He was a man used to ruling by force, not by intelligence. Honorio came out of the house flanked by two men and planted himself in front of Amparo and Genado. "Who are you? And why are you on my land asking about dead men?" His voice had the tone of someone unused to being disobeyed. Amparo was afraid. How could she not be? Alone. Pregnant. Facing down a powerful man and his hired muscle on land she didn't know. But she thought of Refugio. She thought of her son. And the fear, though it didn't leave her, stopped being in charge. "My name is Amparo," she said, as steady as she could manage. "I'm the widow of Refugio, son of Eusebio Pelaez, your father Cristoforo's brother. I've come because the child I'm carrying is the great-grandson of the man who built this ranch, and because I have proof that half of this land belongs to him." Silence dropped over the yard like a stone. Honorio looked at her the way you'd look at an insect that had suddenly started talking. Then he laughed, a laugh with nothing funny in it. "You're out of your mind," he said. "My father was always the sole owner of this land. He never had a brother. And even if he had, what proof could a starving woman covered in dust possibly have? Get off my property before I set the dogs on you." "I have the letter," Amparo said. She let the words drop into the yard like a stone into a well, and waited for the echo. It came across Honorio's face. The laugh froze. Something flickered behind his eyes before he could stop it. Recognition, fear, the shadow of something he'd heard whispered about as a boy. The rare times his father, drunk or frightened, had muttered about a letter that might someday resurface. Amparo, watching him with the focus of someone gambling her life on it, understood two things in that instant. She understood that Honorio knew perfectly well his father had had a brother, whatever he'd just claimed. And she understood that the word letter meant something to him, that he feared it, that it was the ghost this family had spent 20 years hoping would never come back. And a man who's afraid, she thought, has already lost half the fight. There's no letter, Honorio said, but his voice had changed. There is, Amparo said, and it's somewhere safe. A half-lie. The letter was on her, stitched into her clothes, but she wasn't foolish enough to say that. If you hurt me, that letter goes straight to the authorities in San Cristobal. Not the ones your grandfather bought 20 years ago. The ones who answer to no one now. And then you won't just lose half the ranch. You'll lose all of it. For theft, and for whatever you did to a pregnant widow. 20 years of silence. Undone. What followed was a standoff that lasted days. Honorio didn't feed her to the dogs because the mention of the letter, and of San Cristobal, had planted a doubt he couldn't shake. A man can make a stranger disappear without consequence. But if that stranger had already left evidence with someone else, making her disappear could be far more dangerous than simply hearing her out. Honorio was brutal, but not stupid enough to miss that. So he tried to solve it the way men like him solve things when force won't work. Bribery and manipulation. First, he sent his wife to offer Amparo a bag of coins to leave and forget everything. Amparo refused. Then Honorio himself offered more, far more, on the condition she hand over the letter and vanish. Amparo understood that the more they offered, the more the letter was worth, and the more it confirmed the letter was real. She refused again. She stayed on the ranch through it all because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving would have handed Honorio the perfect chance to catch her alone on some empty stretch of road, where nobody would see and nobody would ask questions about one more poor widow who never made it home. Staying near witnesses, even hostile ones, was safer than the open road. Canado hid her in a small room by the stable and looked after her like she was his own granddaughter, smuggling her food, passing along what he overheard in the main house, warning her of Honorio's plans. More than once, fear nearly broke her, alone, pregnant, surrounded by people who wanted her gone or dead. But every time it closed in, she'd rest a hand on her belly, feel her son, and find her footing again. And one night, Genaro finally told her everything he'd swallowed for 20 years. "I saw all of it, girl," he said. "I saw Don Crisoforo bring in the bot officials. I saw them present forged papers claiming the old man, their father, left everything to Crisoforo alone. It was a lie. The old man wanted it split evenly between his sons. I was there the day he made his real will with the notary. I was standing right there. That's how I know the letter you're carrying is genuine. It's the true will, the one Crisoforo could never destroy, because Eusebio took it with him." "Would you testify?" Amparo asked. "In front of the authorities. Say what you saw." Genaro was quiet a long time. It was a heavy thing to ask of an old man, to spend the end of his life finally standing up to the family he'd served and feared for 70 years. He lowered his head. 20 years of fear lived in that silence. 20 years of looking away. 20 years of carrying a truth that sat on his chest like a stone he'd never once set down. "My whole life I stayed quiet to survive," he said finally. "I watched a good man get robbed of everything. And I said nothing, because I told myself a laborer who talks ends up dead, or out on the road with nothing. Told myself I had no choice." He looked up, and there was something new in his tired eyes. "And look what it got me. An old man about to die in the same stable where I watched the worst injustice of my life happen. I survived. Sure. For what? I'm dying with this rotting inside me." He sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded, and something about the way he did it made him look years younger. "Yes, girl, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything I saw in front of whoever needs to hear it, even if it's the last thing I do. It's the one decent thing I have left in me, for Eusebio, who was a good man and didn't deserve what they did to him. And for that child you're carrying, the only piece of him left in this world. Nobody's taking what's his while I've still got a tongue to speak with." The justice that finally found its way back. Amparo didn't face the family alone. That was her one real advantage. Before dawn one morning, with Genaro's help, she slipped off the ranch without Honorio knowing and made her way to the nearest town, where she caught a cart to San Cristobal de las Casas. She carried the letter, She carried Genaro's promise to testify, and she carried something stronger than any document, the resolve of a mother who was not going to watch her son inherit the same theft that had followed his father and grandfather. In San Cristobal, she found a judge, not one from the highlands, bought and paid for by the Pelayas family for generations, but a city judge out of their reach. She laid the letter in front of him with shaking hands, staking everything she'd traveled for on that single gesture. Experts examined the document, men who knew the old seals, the old forms a will took in the grandfather's time. They held it to the light, checked the seal, verified the witnesses' names, and one by one, nodded. The seal was authentic. The signatures checked out. The dates lined up. It was, beyond doubt, the real will, the one dividing the Highland Ranch equally between the two brothers. The exact document Cristoforo had spent 20 years swearing didn't exist. When Genaro arrived days later to testify to what he'd witnessed, the case was sealed. This time, the money didn't win. The fraud was confirmed. The court ordered the theft reversed and recognized Refugio's rightful claim. And, through his death, his unborn sons, to half of the Highland Ranch his great-grandfather had built. Honorio fought it, of course. Shouted, threatened, poured money into lawyers. But lawyers don't count for much against a genuine will and an eyewitness. Old Cristoforo, the man who'd started it all, died in his bed in the middle of the proceedings, taking his resentment to the grave without ever seeing how it ended. The one thing Amparo regretted, because she would have liked him to know before he died that his crime hadn't won. What Refugio asked for Amparo gave birth to a healthy boy that fall, in a house of her own, on the half of the ranch that was rightfully her son's, not an easy piece to keep. Sharing the land with a bitter Honorio meant years of Cold War. But it was a war Amparo fought from a position of strength. The law and the truth were finally on her side, not the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. She named the boy Eusebio, after the great-grandfather who had been robbed and had spent his whole poor life holding on to the one piece of proof that would eventually give his descendants back what was theirs. Genaro lived long enough to know the child. The old man who'd stayed silent for 20 years and finally spoke spent his last months as a kind of grandfather to little Eusebio, sitting in the sun with the boy in his arms, telling him stories the child was too young to understand, about the good years on the ranch, about the grandfather who built it, about the good Eusebio who'd been wronged. He died in peace on the same land where he'd served his whole life. But this time, with a clear conscience, having helped set right the injustice he'd once watched happen and said nothing about. Amparo buried him with full honors because by the end, that's exactly what he'd become. Family. In the years that followed, Amparo would sometimes sit on her porch and look out at the land her son would one day inherit whole. And she'd think of Refugio, her quiet husband, his old sadness, his final delirious words, begging her not to let their son be born with nothing. She'd kept that promise. She'd crossed half a country pregnant, stood up to a powerful family, risked everything she had, and everything her son would ever have. But she'd kept it. Refugio's son was not born with nothing. He was born with a name, with land, with a story that was no longer about theft, but about justice, finally collected. And it had all started with a letter sewn into the lining of a jacket and a name spoken out loud at the gate of a ranch by a woman covered in dust that nobody wanted to let in, because some truths can stay buried for 20 years or longer. But it only takes one person with the nerve to dig them up, and to say the forbidden name out loud, for justice, however late, to finally find its way home.